There we go. Some different types of bones. We can classify bones based on their shape. We can classify them. You have all sorts of different types of bones. So we classify them based on shape, based on their composition, their organization, and then we can also look at bone markings. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the different types of shapes that there are. And so this is showing all of the shapes. We have flat bones, sutural bones, irregular bones, short bones, sesamoid bones, and long bones. So we're going to look at all of those, and just you'd have to be able to describe those on the lecture exam. So first we'll look at this flat bone. The flat bone is this is showing the parietal bone, which is in your skull. So you have other flat bones in your body, like your breastbone, which is the sternum. Your pelvis has some flat bone in it, although most of it's irregular. Your ribs are flat bones. So the flat bones are important because inside the flat bones, there's like two. We're going to show you the structure later, but this is where we find red bone marrow. So that's where a lot of your blood cells are going to be produced, right? So those are important. Now in the skull, when we're looking at those flat bones, here's some other bones here. These are called sutural bones. The sutural bones, so the sutures are where these flat bones come together. So like here's a parietal bone here, and then we look at this side over here, that's a parietal bone also. Okay, and what we find in between them, where they come together, this jagged line, that's called a suture. So those sutures don't start out when you're young, when you're first born. There's actually fibrous tissue in between them. And then as you get to be 2 years old and 5 years old, they start to really pull in together, and those sutures become much more solid. But sometimes they don't come together quite perfectly. So where they don't come quite perfectly together, another bone will be formed, and we call that a sutural bone because it's a bone that's in the sutures of the skull, right? So it's a sutural bone. Okay, then we also have, we're going to look at long bones. So we end up talking a lot about long bones. There's several long bones. A long bone is just longer than it is wide, right? So it's longer than it is wide. So we have all sorts of long bones. Your arm has, the humerus, and then you have the radius and ulna. And then in your hand, you have all sorts of long bones. In the palm of your hand, in your fingers, they're all a whole bunch of long bones. In the legs, we have the femur, and then we're going to look at the tibia and the fibula, and then in the foot and the toes, you also have long bones. So there are a lot of long bones throughout your whole body. So we need to talk about those as well. There's another type of bone that's called the sesamoid bone. A good example of that is the patella or the kneecap. That's the kneecap. So what a sesamoid bone is, it's a bone that is embedded in a tendon, right? So it's embedded in a tendon. A tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. So we call it a sesamoid bone. You also have a sesamoid bone up in your hand called the pisiform. Okay? So there's a couple of those. Then we look at these bones, which are called short bones. Short bones are about as wide as they are deep, wide as they are long. Okay? They might not be exactly square-shaped, but they don't have a lot of length to them. And so the carpal bones are short bones. We also see those are in your wrist, right? In the wrist. We also see in your ankle, there's some bones that are called the tarsal bones. Those are also short bones. Okay, then we have irregular bones. So an irregular bone is, it just doesn't have a lot of uniformity to it. We notice this when we look at the vertebrae. Those are the bones in your spine. And there's, you know, many bones, like 31. We have some in the cervicals, in the thoracics, in the lumbar region, in the sacral region, in the coccyx. So there's a lot of these bones. But they're irregular because the front of it does not look anything like the back of it. So we call it an irregular bone. So that's how we classify bones based on their shapes.
Did you say that the flat bones are the only ones that are the red bone marrow?
No, I didn't. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So red bone marrow can also be found in the proximal ends of the long bones.
Okay.
It can be found, so they're found in other places, but flat bones and proximal end of the long bones are the primary places where the red bone marrow is. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the skeleton. Chapter 6, this whole unit here is going to talk about bones and muscles. That's what we're doing, is we're looking at bones and muscles, so the skeletal system and the muscular system. Chapter 6 just talks about the skeletal system. It's just about bone tissue. And another name for bone tissue is osseous tissue. So osseous tissue and bone tissue are the same thing. Osseous tissue. And then we're going to look at different types of bones. First thing we're going to talk about is what are the functions of osseous tissue, right? What are the functions? Well, first of all, when you think of osseous tissue, of course, that's bone. You think of support, right? So it adds support to your body. It supports your whole frame. It's your framework. Yes? Why is that not on? The second function of bone tissue then is leverage. Leverage. Bones act as levers, right? So one bone can move away from another bone and can help to cause movement. Another function is protection. You know, like think of the skull. The skull protects your brain. The spine protects the spinal cord. Your rib cage protects all of your thoracic organs. Another function is the storage of minerals. Guess what mineral?
Calcium.
Yep, calcium and phosphorus. Okay. It also stores lipids. We're going to see that lipids can be stored in the long bones. In the yellow bone marrow. Okay, and then the last one that we have is blood cell production. That's the last function, blood cell production. So the bone marrow that we're going to look at, it produces red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. Okay? And those are stored in the red bone marrow. Red bone marrow. Okay, so let's take a look at some, let's see. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at two specific types of bone shapes. We're going to look at the long bones and we're going to look at the flat bones. Now, bones are organized. When we classify bones by organization, we're looking at how do the cells in the tissues organize themselves. And so we're always going to find two different types of organization. We're going to find compact bone and we're going to find spongy bone. So we'll take a look at both of those different types of bone based on organization. And both of these, the long bones and the flat bones, have both. They have compact bone, which is really hard and packed together, and then they have spongy bone, which has a lot of holes in it, just like a sponge does, right? So when we look at these bones, we're going to see both of these types of bone organization in there. So we'll start by looking at the flat bone, I think. I usually start with the long bone. I'm going to start with the flat bone because that seems to be a little simpler, right? So it looks like a sandwich. This is a skull bone. One of the cranial bones, and we can see on the top we have compact bone. It's really densely packed bone. On the bottom we have compact bone as well, and in the middle we have spongy bone. So we have compact bone on the outside, it's like a sandwich, and then spongy bone on the middle, in the middle, right? So it's like a sandwich. Okay. And it's in that spongy bone where all of those holes are. That's where that material called bone marrow would be. And in flat bones like this, we find the red bone marrow. And of course, red bone marrow is where those bone cells would be produced. So it's very important. So it's in between all of those little holes in here in the spongy bone. Okay. Now the long bone, if we look at the long bone here, it has a different structure. So first we have to name the different parts because it doesn't look quite as, it looks different. The top looks different from the bottom. The proximal end looks different from the distal end. So there's different parts of this long bone. The ends of the long bone are called the epiphyses, or the epiphysis for singular. So that's the end. So we have a proximal end up here. And then down here at the bottom, we have a distal end, or a distal epiphysis. Okay, so we've got the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis, right? Distal is further away. So proximal is up here, distal is down here, right? Then we look at where we have this the longest part of this bone in here. This is called the diaphysis. A less medical term would be called just the shaft, right? And inside that shaft, inside that diaphysis, is a medullary cavity. So it it's open. There's a space in there. It doesn't have spongy bone and it doesn't have compact bone. It's just an empty space. And filling up that empty space is yellow bone marrow.
What is this space called?
The medullary cavity. Yep. Now, yellow bone marrow stores lipids. It stores lipids that can be used for energy, right? So we can tear down lipids and we can produce ATP with it. So we have a storage of lipids in there that we can use if we have to. We can pull it out of there to use it, right? We know that in some patients that have like a blood disease, if they have leukemia, the yellow bone marrow will start to convert to red bone marrow and start producing producing the blood cells, because the red bone marrow is not doing enough of that, right? But that's where we find yellow bone marrow. Now we're going to look at in between. So we've got the epiphyses on the ends, and we've got the diaphysis in the middle, and then there's the area in between the two that is called the metaphysis. Right, the metaphysis. So that's in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So we have the proximal metaphysis, and we have the distal metaphysis. Okay. All right. So the whole diaphysis, the shaft, it has the medullary cavity on the inside, and then on the outside it has compact bone. Compact bone on the outside. So it has a pretty thick layer of compact bone, and then on the inside is the space. As that compact bone gets closer to the epiphyses on both ends, right, so it's getting closer on both ends to the epiphysis, that compact bone starts to really thin out, and as it starts to thin out, you're going to hear this term that's cortex. The cortex. So that's just the compact bone that is really thin when it gets close to the epiphysis, right? It thins out. It's not quite as thick. And on the very end of that epiphysis, we don't have bone at all. We have a remnant of the most common cartilage. And it's also what bones actually start out as before they turn to bone. So what cartilage would that be? There you go. So this at the end is a remnant. It's called hyaline cartilage. It's made of hyaline cartilage, I should say. But it's called the articular surface, or the articular cartilage. Articular cartilage. And that was what I told you before when we were talking about tissues. That's what gets worn down. That gets worn down, and then there's some cartilage in between the bones as well that gets worn down, and now you got bone on bone. Because as soon as you wear this off, you're down to bone, right? So you're going to find that on both ends. Okay. Now, lastly then, when we're talking about the epiphysis, on the inside of the epiphysis, we have spongy bone. So spongy bone is located inside the epiphysis. There's more of it on the proximal end, and that's why we say that red bone marrow is in the spongy bone in the proximal end of the long bones. So we can look at red bone marrow in those locations. That's where blood cells are produced. Okay? So those are all the different parts of the long bone. Yep.
Sorry, did you say there's red bone marrow in both ends, but more in the proximal ends?
Yeah, usually when we talk about where is red bone marrow found, we always say the proximal ends of the long bones and in the flat bones.
Because that's where the majority of it
Yep.
is found. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So because bone is a tissue, a connective tissue, right? We talk about the different types of connective tissue. Bone is the supporting connective tissue. It's one of them. We have to look at the characteristics. So when we're looking at characteristics of connective tissue, again, we're looking at specialized cells. Okay? And then we're looking at the matrix. And if you remember, the matrix is made up of a ground substance and what? Protein fibers, right? Protein fibers. So the matrix is made up of ground substance and protein fibers. So we want to take a look at these in bone. All right, so we're going to look at the specialized cells. I'm going to name them for you right now, though, and then we'll go and look at them a little later. So we have these, well, they used to call them osteoprogenitor, but now they just call them, I think they're just called progenitor. If you look in your textbook, the progenitor cells. Then we have osteoblasts. We have osteoclasts. And we have osteocytes. So we're going to look at what do each one of those things do. What do they do? Right? Then we look at the matrix and the ground substance in matrix. So the ground substance, if you remember, it's what's around the cells and what's around the protein fibers. And the ground substance in bone is going to be hard because it contains calcium. So the ground substance is calcified, and that makes it hard. Okay. Then the protein fibers, the majority of the protein fibers that we find in bone is collagen. And what did I say about collagen? It's what? It allows the tissue to bend. It allows those bones to bend a little bit so they just don't snap whenever there's any little type of pressure on them. Right? All right, so let's take a look. We'll start here by looking at the specialized cells. Here's the 4 different types. We have the osteocyte, the osteoblast, the osteoprogenitor, and the osteoclast. So we'll start by looking at that osteoprogenitor cell. And so this is just showing you where each of them would be found. This is a long bone, and the long bone's been cut in half, so we're looking at a cross-section of it. And we can see that the osteocyte and the osteoblast can be found on the outside. We're going to see, actually, the osteoblast is on the outside here, and the osteocytes are going to be right in the middle in here, so we're going to look at those. And then we look at the osteoprogenitor and the osteoclast, and those are going to be on the inside here. Okay? So we'll start, though, by looking at stop. Okay, how do I get rid of that? Okay. All right, so let's look at first let's look at the osteocyte. Okay. So the osteocyte is the mature bone cell. Okay, it's a mature bone cell. It has created a nice little lacuna around it. So this cell is soft, and if it allowed this calcium to come up too close to it, it would kill off that bone cell, right? So instead, the osteocyte has built a little cave around itself, which we call the lacunae. So this is sitting in a lacunae. Now, the osteocyte is the one that when it was younger, it actually built its own little lacuna, okay? It built its own lacuna. So we're going to look at that, the younger cell, in just a second. Coming away from this cell, from the osteocytes, we see these little canals, and these canals are called canaliculi, because this cell is a living cell. It needs fluid. It needs nutrients. It needs to get rid of its wastes. Those things cannot diffuse through this calcified ground substance. It can't get through there. So instead, it has to get rid of that stuff and receive those things through these little canaliculi. And those canaliculi connect a bunch of osteocytes together so that they're all sharing what they have. Like a nice little community. Okay? So that's a canaliculi, or that's an osteocyte. Now the osteocyte, what its job is, it's a grown-up cell. What its main job is to just repair the cell, or repair the bone if something happens to it. Hang on just a sec. So if you get a fracture, if you fracture the bone, you have a cut right through that bone, now that osteocyte will become active and it'll start producing bone ground substance. It'll produce the ground substance to repair its little cave. Okay? Georgia.
I was wondering how to spell Lacunae, I don't know what that word would look like.
So it's Lacunae is L-A-C-U-N-A, and E at the end is plural. Hmm? Okay, let's take a look at another cell then. Here's the osteoblast. Okay, so the osteoblast is a baby osteocyte. It's a young, immature cell. And the osteoblast hasn't built up its lacunae yet. It hasn't built its own cave. So it's going to produce an immature bone material that's called osteoid. Osteoid. Now, osteoid is soft. It's soft material. And it needs to be calcified in order to become mature bone. So as the osteoblast builds that, then it'll eventually build bone all the way around it. It'll become calcified, and now it will have its own cave, and it becomes an osteocyte. Here we have an osteoprogenitor cell. I have to get rid of this. Okay, so here's our osteoprogenitor cell. It's a big cell. It's a very big cell. The osteoprogenitor cell makes the osteoblast. It's a stem cell. It's a stem cell that makes the osteoblast. So the osteoblast has this life now, right? The osteoprogenitor makes the osteoblast. The osteoblast builds a cave all the way around it. Now it's called an osteocyte. So it's just kind of like the life of that cell. Okay. Then the other type of cell that we have is called the osteoclast. Now the osteoclast is a big looking cell. It's got many, many nuclei. Sometimes it can have up to 50 nuclei in it. And the nuclei all contain a digestive enzyme. So they all have, they make a digestive enzyme. All right, so the osteoclast, its job is to release these enzymes, these digestive enzymes, and it tears down bone, right? So we can see that this cell here is actually making a little divot in the bone, right? So it makes a divot, it's eating old bone. That's what the osteoclast does, clast with a C, it eats old bone. And then the osteoblasts are going to build new bone. So you see, your bone isn't a dead tissue, it's a very live tissue. And the osteoblasts are going to build new bone for you constantly. The osteoclasts are tearing down the old bone that's brittle, right? Because all tissue wears down eventually. Clasts tear it down, blasts build it back up again. And so that happens throughout your whole life. And actually by the time, from the time you're born until the time you're 5 years old, all of your bones have been replaced, right? So and then this is what we call just remodeling. This remodeling will continue through the rest of your life. The bone will always be the same shape. It's not going to change shape unless you have some type of abnormal stresses, which we see in degenerative changes, like in the spine. You can make a square bone become more of a triangular bone because of too many stresses. But this is what happens throughout your whole life, is this type of remodeling. Okay, so those are the cell types. All right, so let's look at the difference between we have the compact bone and the spongy bone. And this picture is kind of showing both of them. The outside picture here, the outside of this bone, right in here, this is called compact bone, right? So if we look at the compact bone, we notice a couple of things. First of all, there's all these circular shaped things. These circular shaped things are called osteons. Right? They're osteons. Osteons are just how they're organized into these concentric circles. And we see that the osteocytes, the cells of bone, they are arranged in a circle around a central opening that has an artery and a vein in it. So we see many osteons. We see one osteon here with concentric circles with those osteocytes in their little lacunae. We see one here. We see one here, we see one here, we see one here, and they all are going to have a central canal. Each one of them are going to have a blood vessel in there. So, bone is very vascular. You break a bone, you bleed, right? There's blood. There's a lot of blood supply to the bone tissue. It needs a lot of fluid, it needs a lot of nutrients. On the outside, then, we have the compact bone is going to be arranged a little bit differently. Now we have a concentric circle around the whole circumference of the bone. So you might see when you're reading the textbook that matrix is called lamellae. So we just give it a name. We call it lamellae. So the lamellae is what's surrounding all of those osteocytes that are arranged in those concentric circles around that central canal. Okay, and it's just packed really tight. Now, if we look at spongy bone over here, spongy bone is arranged differently. It's not organized the same way. It has the same things. It has the matrix, it has the specialized cells, but it's arranged more in what we call trabeculae. So we don't have the osteons. There's no osteons, right? Instead, they have trabeculae where it's more spongy. So we see a lot of openings in between those cells and the tissue and the matrix. So there's openings in there. It looks like a sponge, right? And that's where that red bone marrow would go. So that's the difference between compact bone and spongy bone. It's just basically the organization of everything that's in there. Yes.
So when you do like a bone marrow test,
Yes.
where do they take that? What part of the bone marrow is that?
So they're looking at your red bone marrow, and a lot of times they'll take it right from the pelvis because the pelvis is flat, and so they'll take a needle and stick it in there and draw some out. Yep. The back of your hip. Yeah, they go into the pelvic bone, straight through. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that was a good question. All right, so let's look at now. I want to look at a couple of things first, and then we're going to look at the development of bone. This is just showing the end of this is the end of a long bone. So you can kind of see the difference then between compact and spongy bone. So in the shaft of the bone, you can see that this is thicker here, right? So that's really compact bone, and as it gets to the end up in here, it gets a little bit thinner, so then now that we call that the cortex, and it's a really thin layer of that compact bone. And then when we look inside here, we can see that it's all spongy. There's lots of holes in there. All that whole area in there is real spongy looking. And so that's where all your red bone marrow would be then. As you get down into the shaft, now you see that this is empty, it's open, and that's your medullary cavity. Okay? Couple other things that I want to talk about is that there is a dense irregular connective tissue that covers the outside of the bone, right? So the bone's not just exposed to your body, it's covered by a dense irregular connective tissue. And that dense irregular connective tissue we call the periosteum. So peri means around, osteum means bone, so it's the connective tissue surrounding the bone, at least the shaft of the bone. So we can look at this picture here, and this shows we have some tweezers actually, right? We have some forceps pulling that dense irregular connective tissue away from the bone itself. Now, this periosteum is important because the inner layer of it is a very active layer that has periosteal cells. And the periosteal cells can differentiate, or they can change their function to become an osteoblast. And what did we say osteoblasts do? They make bone, right? They build bone. So this layer here of the periosteum can make the bone thicker, right? Does that make sense? Because it's building bone up here on the edge of the long bone, so that bone will become thicker. Not longer, but thicker. That's what those periosteal cells will do. Convert to osteoblasts, osteoblasts make bones, and the bones can get thicker. Right?
The periosteum, it had a different name when it was covering the cartilage. Or the
Right,
cartilage
so
phase of the bone, right?
yes, and this same type of dense irregular connective tissue covers cartilage, and in that case we call it perichondrium. So here it's periosteum. If it's around cartilage, it's perichondrium.
Okay.
So that's a good point going into our next topic here. The next topic that we're going to talk about is bone development. Bone development, because when the sperm meets the egg, right, that new being has to build bone. It has to build its own skeleton. So bone development actually starts 6 weeks after the sperm meets the egg. At 6 weeks. We start to get the development of the skeleton. Now the thing is that bone, it doesn't start out as bone. We get these structures in there that are made of hyaline cartilage. And they're going to be roughly the same shape as bone. All right? So in this process, this is one of the ways that bone can be developed. Let me just pause here. So we start out as this hyaline cartilage here. And this hyaline cartilage is soft and squishy. It's about the consistency of a banana. So we know the bones can't stay that soft, so they have to, first of all, this hyaline cartilage has to be replaced by bone. So we can't have bones being the consistency of a banana. So when we look at this hyaline cartilage here, it looks like it's roughly in the shape of what a long bone would look like, right? And the cells that are in hyaline cartilage, they're called chondrocytes. So this entire hyaline cartilage is filled with chondrocytes, right? So the cells in the middle of the hyaline cartilage, they're going to get big and they're going to die, and that starts the whole process. They get big and they die. Now when they die, they're leaving a space, and so that space is where bone can actually start to get built, right? So in the next phase, what we see happening after they die, they leave little openings, and the blood supply that's coming to that tissue is going to deliver osteoblasts into the center. And then the osteoblasts are going to build bone in there. Now it's building bone right in the middle, and what did we say about the middle of that bone? We said that it's empty, right? That it's a cavity. It's the medullary cavity. So as soon as the osteoblasts build the bone, then osteoclasts are going to come along and they're going to tear that bone down. Right? They're tearing the middle of that bone down to create that medullary cavity. We still have some of the bone left on the outside here. And then we can see that we have cartilage surrounding it as well. When this happens, when we start to build bone in this area, this is called the primary center for ossification, because this is the first place that ossification occurs, the first place that we are replacing that cartilage with bone. So it is the primary center of ossification. And we have some compact bone being built on the edge of that medullary cavity. And then if we look, we see that that perichondrium, the cells, the perichondrial cells are going to convert to osteoblasts. We're going to get more bone being deposited from that dense irregular connective tissue. As soon as it develops that bone, we now call it periosteum instead of perichondrium. It's just a simple change in name, not in tissue. The important thing here, because I don't want to get stuck in the mud, the important thing is this is the primary center of ossification. Okay? That's our main point here. And it happens in the diaphysis of the long bone. So that's our important point. So then the next step that happens, here you can actually see that medullary cavity that's been built, right?
So the diaphysis is the primary center of ossification, or the medullary?
The diaphysis. The medullary cavity is inside the diaphysis. So that whole area is where we first have that. The question will be, where is the primary center of ossification? And you'd have to say the diaphysis. This is just showing how the medullary cavity is even widened and bigger, and you can see the compact bone, how it's being built on the outside. So that compact bone is being built from those osteoblasts that are coming in, and also from the periosteal cells that are converting to osteoblasts. Okay, then we have the next step here. The next step happens in the epiphysis. And in this area, we have the secondary center of ossification. The secondary center of ossification occurs in the epiphysis. Now, this is where blood vessels will bring in the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts will lay down bone, but it won't get torn down. So it stays there. That's why we have spongy bone inside that epiphysis. It doesn't get torn down. So that's the secondary center of ossification. So we know the primary center is in the epiphysis. We know the secondary center is in the primary center is in the diaphysis. The secondary center is in the epiphysis. Now we have one level left, or one area left in the bone. What is that called? The metaphysis, right? So we had the diaphysis, which is primary. We had the epiphysis, which is secondary. So what happens in that metaphysis? So the metaphysis is stuck in the middle, right? So here we see this picture. And we can see all the spongy bone being built in here. So there's spongy bone in here. We can see the medullary cavity down here, right? But we have this area right in here, which is the metaphysis, and it still has all of that cartilage. There's all that hyaline cartilage still in there, and it has to be converted to bone. All this hyaline cartilage does. Now, the thing with the hyaline cartilage is those chondrocytes in the cartilage, they are continually producing more chondrocytes. They're going through mitosis, producing more chondrocytes. And they're making this metaphysis longer, right? They're making it longer. And then the osteoblasts are coming up right behind them, and they're replacing the dead ones, the open spaces, because of the dead cells. They're replacing that with bone. They're depositing bone in there. So as this cartilage lengthens, as we start to see the chondrocytes being produced in here, that's going to make the bone longer. It makes the bone longer. So in layman's term, what do you think we call the metaphysis right here then? That's right. That's the growth plate. It's the growth plate. Okay, so there's a race that goes on where the chondrocytes are making the cartilage longer, and then the osteoblasts come up behind it, and they're depositing bone, right? So it's a race, and they're just going at the same pace, always going at the same pace, making that bone longer and longer and longer, and suddenly you hit puberty, right? So at puberty, what happens is a hormone called growth hormone is released. And that growth hormone stimulates those chondrocytes to go nuts. And all of a sudden, that long bone goes whoosh, and you see people just go woof, and now they're growing 2 inches a year, right? Because that growth hormone is stimulating the chondrocytes. Stimulates the chondrocytes. So that happens first in puberty, and then we get another hormone that's going to be released, one that's different in the females than the males. It's a sex hormone. What do we call those? What do you know? Estrogen. Right, so in the female, we have estrogen, and in the male, we have testosterone. Both estrogen and testosterone stimulate the osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts start proliferating or dividing faster than the chondrocytes, right? So our chondrocytes they're dividing, the new cells are making the bone longer, the osteoblasts are coming up along behind them. Growth hormone makes those chondrocytes go faster. Estrogen and testosterone make the osteoblasts go faster. And eventually, at the end of puberty, the osteoblasts catch up to the chondrocytes, and that's the end of the growth plate. When the osteoblasts catch those chondrocytes, that's the end of the growth plate.
Is it important to know in this chapter what gland the hormones are released from at all?
We're going to look at, no, we're going to look at those later. Right? Yep.
Would you be able to print this sheet for us?
Or upload this video.
I'm uploading every video onto your, it's on your class in Canvas. So just look under Unit 1 and look for the video. I've been uploading them all. I think there's a module actually that says, yeah, it says lab videos from lecture or something like that. So, yep, you're welcome. Now the interesting thing is here that estrogen stimulates the osteoblasts faster than testosterone does. What does that mean for the females?
Shorter.
Yeah, that means that females are going to stop, their growth plate is going to close before the men, right? So what we find in females is that about 2 years after the start of their period, that's when the osteoblasts catch up, and that's pretty much the end of their growth. Maybe they stop growing when they're 15, but that's going to be the end of their growth. The males, the testosterone is going to get those osteoblasts going, but not as fast. So we see the boys keep growing when they're sophomores, juniors, seniors in high school, freshmen, sophomore in college, up until they're 21, 22. They still grow because the testosterone is not causing the osteoblast to go as fast. Okay, does that all make sense?
Yes.
I do have a little picture here, I think. Nope, I guess that's about it. Here a second and tell you the two different ways that bone can be developed. And the one way starts as hyaline cartilage. That's the most common bone that we'll see built in the body, but I want you to know both. So the first type of bone development is called endochondral, ossification. Okay, so ossification means the development of bone. Ossification, in this case, we're looking at endo means inside, chondral means cartilage. In this case, the bone starts out as cartilage, and the cartilage it starts out as is hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage will become bone. And we're going to look at the steps. We're just going to see how that happens, show you a couple of key things that happen during that development. And then this is immature bone, so then that bone has to be calcified by putting calcium into the bone tissue, right? Calcium gets stored in the bone tissue to make it hard. So most of the bones in your body are going to be formed through this endochondral ossification. Another type of ossification, though, is called intramembranous ossification. Okay? So this inside membrane. So think about one of the membranes that we learned about was the cutaneous membrane. So these bones are going to develop from the dermis, and they will become bone. There's not as many bones that develop through this, so I'm not going to spend as much time on this. Actually, this is it. I'm going to tell you a few of the bones that develop this way. The flat bones in your skull. They develop through intramembranous ossification. Your mandible, which is your lower jawbone, and your clavicle, which is your collarbone. Those bones develop through intramembranous ossification. Otherwise, all the rest of them are going to develop as from hyaline cartilage. Okay. show you this I have a picture of. So this is the growth plate, and when the growth plate is closed. So we give the growth plate a medical term. The growth plate, you can see by these arrows, these white arrows here. That's a growth plate. So this is a long bone. This whole thing is the long bone. This is the epiphysis right here. This is the diaphysis right there. And then where that line is through there, that's the cartilage. And we call that the epiphyseal cartilage. It's hyaline cartilage. It's spongy. It's like banana, right? So if you break that, now you've disrupted those chondrocytes. If you have a fracture through that, here's another one right here in the radius. See that? That space, that dark space in there? That is hyaline cartilage. So if you fracture that, now you've disrupted those chondrocytes. The chondrocytes aren't going to want to divide. So what's going to happen to that arm? Possibly. Might end up being shorter than the same bone on the other arm because those chondrocytes have been disrupted. So we don't want to break, we don't want to fracture the epiphyseal cartilages. We don't want to fracture the bone before those growth plates have closed, right? So now we look at, on the other side, and we look at the same space, and now the space is gone. The osteoblasts have caught up to the chondrocytes. It's all bone now. There's no cartilage left in there. And now we call it an epiphyseal line. So radiologists can still see like a white line going through there, but it's not a dark radiolucent line that we would see with cartilage. Okay?
With the epiphyseal cartilage and epiphyseal lines, are those just terms for the visual of the
Both. They're both. They're both the physical, this is what it is, and visual, this is what you see on the x-ray.
Okay, so metaphysis and epiphyseal are kind of interchangeable? Is that-
Yeah,
that's what I'm wondering.
right, I understand. Why wouldn't it be called a metaphyseal cartilage, right?
That's where I'm getting confused, I guess.
Because there's two sides to it. There's the epiphyseal side, which has mostly cartilage, and then there's the diaphyseal side of the metaphysis, which is now bone,
Which is
because
like
the osteoblast.
osteoblast or
Right, so
something.
this radiolucent line that you see, that is all cartilage, and then the diaphyseal side of the metaphysis would be right here, and that's all calcified. So that's why they call it epiphyseal cartilage, because it's on the side of the epiphysis rather than on the side of
So
the
the whole
diaphysis.
thing is the metaphysis.
Yep.
And then.
This whole area would be called the metaphysis.
Okay.
And, yeah. Does that make sense? Not there, wait, hang on. This whole thing would be the metaphysis, right?
Okay.
This is the epiphysis, this is the diaphysis,
So
right?
epiphysis is just referring to that upper portion of the,
So,
where the cartilage is.
whoops. Oh, it's not gonna let me, darn, won't let me erase it. Okay, so when we're looking at, yeah, it's not gonna let me do it. Okay, so I'm gonna do like a red pen here. This where it's radial, that's the cartilage, right? So we saw the cartilage going through there, and then this part over here is bone. So we've got cartilage and bone. That whole area is the metaphysis.
Okay.
But because this part is cartilage and this part is bone, we call this the epiphyseal cartilage because it's on the epiphyseal side of the metaphysis.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay,
Thank
yep.
need to know that though for this?
No, but that was a good question.
It is.
It was a good question, so I wanted to address it. Okay, so when we come back, I'm going to go over one other thing here quickly, and then when we come back, I'm going to get into some hormones and some like disorders like osteoporosis. But this is just the composition of bone, and so I want to make sure that you understand what all of the bone tissue is made of. Like 40% of it is calcium. So that calcium has to be packed in there to make that ground substance really hard. And then another third of it, 33%, is collagen fibers that help to make it bendy. And then there's just some other, we see some other ions, some other minerals, some other components, and those I'm not gonna have you memorize, but, you know, like 40% of it is calcium, another third of it is the collagen fibers, okay? So when we come back, we're gonna talk about, kind of like the aging process and how estrogen and, causes osteoporosis, okay? And different hormones that affect bone.
So we should just know the amount of calcium and the amount of collagen.
Yep, yep. So we're going to talk about bone now as a very dynamic structure. It's not a dead tissue like you normally think of bone. It has a lot of blood supply. It has a lot of cells in there. So it's a very dynamic tissue. And bone goes through a process which we call remodeling. So this is after the bones have been developed. They're completely developed. Your bones are still going to be changing, not in shape or size after complete development. You know, a person reaches skeletal maturity somewhere around 25 years of age, then their bones completely stop growing. But after that period, their bones are constantly going to remodel. So bone tissue gets old. Just like all the tissues in your body age, bone tissue gets old, but we want to make sure that the bone tissue stays healthy. So the osteoclasts will tear down old bone, right? They tear down old bone. And then the osteoblasts will build new bone. And this is going to happen throughout your lifetime then. That's a continuous remodeling process that occurs, right? So one of the things that helps bone to become stronger then throughout this remodeling process is exercise. Especially exercise like some type of weight lifting, weight bearing type of exercise. Because when you're doing weightlifting, for example, and you're making your muscles strain, the tendons are pulling away from the bone. And when the tendons pull away from the bone, it creates a little electrical field. And that electrical field, it attracts osteoblasts. What do osteoblasts do? Build bone, right? So your bones become more dense. They become thicker and denser. So exercise, especially weight bearing, stimulates osteoblasts. To make the bone denser. Okay, makes the bone denser. If a bone is unstressed, within a few weeks, you'll lose about a third of the density of the bone. So this is really important in patients that are just, they're bedridden, or elderly patients. We need to get them up, get them moving. You know, we need to stress their bones a little bit. Then another thing that's really important for bones is nutrition. So first, with normal growth of bone from gestation all the way to age 25, of course, calcium and phosphate is going to be very important because those are the main minerals that make up the bulk of the bone. There's some other vitamins that are important: vitamin C, vitamin K, vitamin B12. They all help produce and maintain the collagen fibers. And collagen fibers keep the bones flexible, we said. So those are very important. Vitamin A is also very important. Vitamin A stimulates osteoblasts. Okay, so those are all some really important nutritional effects on bone. We need these minerals and these vitamins. Okay, then we also have hormonal effects. So hormones affect how healthy the bone is. One type of hormone is called parathyroid hormone, PTH, parathyroid. It is from the parathyroid glands. Okay? Parathyroid glands are in your neck. So you have your thyroid gland right below your Adam's apple, and right behind that thyroid gland are 4 little pea-shaped glands called the parathyroid glands. And these glands secrete this hormone called PTH, or parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone, if you remember nothing else, what parathyroid hormone does is it increases calcium in your blood. It increases calcium in your blood, right? So where is calcium most of the time? 99% of your calcium is going to be in your bones. Well, we also have to have a small amount in your blood because calcium is necessary for many things. One of the things it does is it helps neural conduction. So it helps the nerve impulses, that conduction. So you have to have just the right amount. And if you don't have, if you have too much calcium, then your bones or your muscles are going to become really unresponsive. And if you don't have enough calcium, then your muscles are going to become hyper-responsive. So we want to make sure that we have the right amount of calcium in your blood. So parathyroid hormone increases the calcium in your blood. And we have another hormone that's called calcitriol. Calcitriol is from the kidneys. Calcitriol also increases calcium in your blood. We'll talk a little bit briefly on how these hormones do this in just a minute. And then the last one that we have is called calcitonin. Calcitonin. So calcitonin is from the thyroid gland. That's the gland in your neck just below your Adam's apple. And calcitonin decreases calcium in your blood. So together, these 3 hormones are able to keep your calcium levels right where it's supposed to be, between 8.5 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. That's how much you should have in your blood, right? So these hormones help to keep it that way. And what they do is they're either pulling calcium out of the bone to put it in the blood, or they're pulling calcium from the blood and putting it in the bone, depending on your blood level of calcium, right? So if your blood level of calcium is high, it's too high, we need to get rid of it. So then calcitonin would come into effect and we would get rid of it. Calcitonin would be released and it would help to decrease the calcium in your blood. If your calcium levels in your blood are too low, then PTH and calcitriol would come into play. And they would increase the blood calcium by pulling calcium out of your bone. So let's look at these ways. Whenever we are looking at, your blood calcium levels, we want to think of 3 different organs that can help to maintain your calcium homeostasis. So I'm going to say calcium homeostasis. Calcium homeostasis. All right? So let's say that your blood calcium is too high. For example. Okay, which means it's over 11 milligrams per deciliter. Well, in that case, your body, you would release calcitonin. And calcitonin is going to have an effect on different areas in your body. First of all, in the bone. Okay, so we have too much calcium in our blood. What would we want to do with that concerning the bone?
Build up the bone to store it.
Right, we would want to make new bone so that we would have a new place for calcium to be stored. So in the bone, you would make new bone. And what cells make new bones?
Osteoblast.
Right, so the osteoblasts would be stimulated. You would make new bone, and then calcium would be pulled out of the blood and put into the new bone. Okay. Calcitonin is the hormone that makes that happen, right? Another place that can affect calcium levels, another place in your body, are your kidneys. So your kidneys have the ability to either reabsorb things or urinate them out. So if you have too much calcium in your blood, what are the kidneys going to want to do? Urinate out the calcium, right? So at the kidneys, you would urinate calcium, and you would not reabsorb it. And then the last place would be in the intestines. So in the intestines, you eat foods that contain calcium, and if you already had too much calcium in there, then your intestines would absorb less from your diet, right? These are all ways to make sure that that blood calcium level stays under 11 milligrams per deciliter, right? Let's look at an example of what if your calcium levels are too low. Which means it's under 8.5. If it's under 8.5 milligrams per deciliter, we've got to get the blood calcium levels back up. So what would happen at the bone? If we wanted to raise our calcium levels in our blood up, what would we do in the bone?
Osteoclast would tear it down.
Right, we would tear it down. We'd tear down the bone. Because by dissolving the bone, you're releasing the calcium, and the calcium's going to go back into the blood. And what cells do that?
Osteoclast.
There you go, osteoclasts. So the osteoclast would be stimulated, right? And then if we looked at the kidneys, again, the kidneys can either reabsorb or urinate out. If we need more calcium to stay in the body, what would we do? Reabsorb. So the kidneys would reabsorb calcium and not filter it out, not urinate it out. And the last place then is the intestines. And so we can either absorb or not absorb from our diet. In this case, we would want to absorb, right? So the intestines would absorb more calcium. And it is actually, to absorb more calcium, that requires the hormone calcitriol. Calcitriol, okay? So we've got these, and the bone, the kidneys, and the intestines here, this is all due to the parathyroid hormone. So the parathyroid hormone will stimulate the osteoclasts. The parathyroid hormone will cause the kidneys to reabsorb more calcium. The parathyroid hormone will cause the intestines to absorb more calcium by stimulating calcitriol. Okay, so parathyroid hormone has the major control over all of that. Okay, we talked about a couple other things too, a couple other hormones. We talked about growth hormone. So growth hormone is important, especially during growth, because it will increase the growth of cartilage. And we talked about how in the growth plate, you need the cartilage to grow first, and then the osteoblast to lay down bone when those chondrocytes die, right? So we need growth hormone to increase the growth of cartilage. Thyroxine is another hormone from the thyroid, and that also is important in growth of the skeleton. Thyroxine stimulates bone growth. Okay. And then finally, I want to look at those two hormones that we talked about, estrogen and testosterone. We said both of those stimulate the osteoblasts. Estrogen just stimulates them faster than testosterone does. So it stimulates these osteoblasts. So they're necessary throughout life to keep those osteoblasts going at the same pace as the osteoclasts during remodeling. So osteoclasts tear down bone, tear down bone, tear down bone. Osteoblasts are going at the same pace, building bone, building bone, building bone. So you're constantly replacing that old bone with new bone. Okay? We said that in puberty, the estrogen and testosterone help to close that growth plate. But they're still important throughout the rest of your life with remodeling. You know, the osteoclasts are tearing down bone, and the osteoblasts are building up bone, and they go at this same pace, right? But then all of a sudden, we see this especially with women, they hit a certain age, 50, 55, and they start to go through this process called menopause. And during menopause, what happens to estrogen levels? Estrogen levels start to decline rapidly. So what that means is what happens to the osteoblasts? They're not stimulated, right? So now instead of having osteoclasts tearing it down and osteoblasts building it up and they're going at the same pace, now we've got osteoclasts still tearing the bone down, but osteoblasts slugging behind. What's going to happen to our density of our bone? It's going to decrease, right? It's going to decrease. And so that's what we see. This is normal looking bone, right? This is spongy bone, normal looking spongy bone. You can see some divots in here where the osteoclasts have been busy, but for the most part, it's a nice dense bone. Osteoclasts are tearing down, osteoblasts are building up, and the bone looks nice and healthy. But then we get to the next picture here, and now we see that it looks like this. You know, those products like Fosamax and Boniva, I think. You know, those products, they slow down the osteoclasts. So now osteoclasts and osteoblasts are both going at a slower pace. We're still taking out old bone and putting in new bone. So the bone looks better, but it's old bone. And so we find that we have almost as many fractures as we did before. So now what they're trying to do is stimulate the osteoblast to catch up to where they're supposed to be. But that takes a little maneuvering in the lab, so they're still working on that.
So the older bone is brittle?
The older bone is more dense but brittle.
Okay.
They sometimes give women more estrogen. so they can help
Well,
with
and
spirit.
estrogen would help, you would think, right? Give them estrogen. Give the women estrogen because that would stimulate osteoblasts, but we don't because,
Stimulates other cell growth as well.
right,
Yeah.
estrogen stimulates cell growth and that could cause cancers. So it could increase the potential of breast cancer and other cancers, so. Okay, so then that ends this chapter then on osseous tissue and skeletal structure. This. Osteoclasts are still doing their job. They're tearing old bone down. But now estrogen levels have plummeted and the osteoblasts aren't keeping up. So they're not filling in those gaps like they should, right? So what did we decide to do? What did we try to do in pharmaceuticals? We tried to develop products that would not stimulate osteoblasts, because that's hard to do, but instead to inhibit the osteoclasts. So the osteoclasts slowed down to the pace of the osteoblasts. So they slowed down. Now they're both slow. What does that mean for the health of the bone tissue?
It evens out.
You have more bone, but you have, it's old bone. That's the problem. So when we look at the bone,